The wayfinding landscape is changing, so welcome to Endpoint's new Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. We want to connect with digital and tech specialists to exchange knowledge of new technologies and wayfinding solutions. We want to shape the future of digital wayfinding through discussion, collaboration, and shared expertise. And this is why we have created this new podcast series. Enjoy the episode.
So, welcome back, everybody. This is the latest instalment of our Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. And today we have with us Leatrice Eiseman, Director of the Eiseman Centre for Colour Information and Training and Executive Director of the Pantone Colour Institute. Thanks for coming along, Lee. Shall we call you Lee?
Yes, certainly.
Brilliant. So I'll just give a little introduction. So you're a professional colour specialist, often referred to as the international colour guru, and your expertise is recognised worldwide. You've been widely quoted in Fortune magazine and Wall Street Journal as one of the most influential people in the world of colour. And you're also the author of 10 books on the subject. So I think we can safely say we have a colour expert in our midst. So, welcome to the podcast. And I know I and a lot of the guys in the studio have been, actually really excited about this discussion. So I guess the first thing is tell us a bit about yourself. How did you get into colour? What was your journey to where you are today, and why does it interest you so much?
Well, from the time I was a child, and those of us who are involved in the world of color tell the same story, that it was recognized early on that I had this talent and ability to choose colors, to put colors together. And of course, my parents were an influence in that direction. My father was in the fashion field. My mother loved color. She would, instead of doing spring cleaning every year, she would repaint the inside of the house. So I was accustomed to change and loved it. And I found that my parents and a beloved aunt were always asking my advice about what colors to put together, even when I was as young as 10 years old. So I think it's like anything else. If you are a child prodigy and you can sit down and play the piano at age 2, that's telling you that you have a special talent in that direction. And in my case, I think I'm not going to claim that I'm a great artist, but at least I know that I have that sense of color. In addition to that, I went on to school. Eventually, I took a program at UCLA where they allowed me to create my own practicum, which of course was on color. I taught color for the Los Angeles Unified School District, created a prototype class. And then my husband, who was a music publisher, heard me speak one day. And he said, if you don't publish your concept, somebody's going to hear you speak and they're going to publish it. You better get a book out. And that started my journey of writing my 10 books.
Wow. Okay. Superb. So, I mean, I guess starting from the very, very beginning, how do you define colour? What is colour? I know it's sort of obvious, but probably not that obvious scientifically. Do you have a definition? How do you describe colour?
Well, I think it can be different for different people. I mean, obviously, people who are colorblind have an issue with seeing color. But at the same time, we've done enough studies through the Pantone Colour Institute and through my own research for clients that there are certain emotions that color can evoke. Now, whether they are learned, and, we were told as children, red is dangerous, don't touch the fire. We are told that Valentine's Day is pink, or whatever our particular culture may reveal to us. But at the same time, there's evidence that we have an innate sense of color. And that comes from, eons of time of having feelings about color reinstated. I mentioned the red. That's the most obvious. We are told that we shouldn't touch it. but we inherently know that red is a color that's going to cause attention. We can't ignore it. It's impossible. So there is this physiological aspect of color as well as the psychological aspect of color. And I've done a lot of study, a lot of research. There's much that has been written about it. And of course, there are going to be some exceptions to the rule, depending on a person's personal experience with color. But generally, our color word association studies tell us a very general picture about color, and then we dig a little further when we work, let's say, with a client on a specific color. If it's for branding, if it's for product, how does the emotion of the color play into how the consumer is going to see that color on a very general level? That gives us a place to start about how we use color in a particular context.
Okay, so is that the main sort of thrust of your commercial activity? You work with brands in terms of helping choose particular colours for particular products or corporate identities?
Yes, that is one of the most important areas that I work in, because obviously there are a lot of opinions out there about color. There's a lot of information that is dispelled, via the internet, and I look at it and I can't believe some of the things that I read, because they're absolutely untrue and haven't been proven. I have to give you a good anecdote about that. I've been told people will say that they read that yellow causes anxiety and we should never use yellow in the interior of a home. Absolutely untrue. There are no studies that prove that. As a matter of fact, yellow is suggested for people who suffer from seasonal affective disorder, the SAD syndrome, which, I used to live in Seattle. And I've been to London many times, and I know that is definitely a possibility when there's no sunlight, which people perceive of as a yellow light. If you enter that yellow into their field of vision, then it kind of tricks the mind into believing that the sun is shining, which elevates our mood. So there are many facets of how we use the color. I use it in branding and product development for interiors, wherever color is necessary. And of course, in every industry today, it's a necessity to know more about color and to get it from an expert and not just hearsay.
So going back to this emotional side of colour, I mean, is there, I find one of the difficulties I have with colour is, and my wardrobe would back this up, I'm very conservative. I find colour really subjective. Is there, in this sort of age of data and facts, you talked about research. I mean, I guess there's been lots of research on colour and emotional response to colour. Can you talk us through some of that research?
Well, there has been research and a great deal of it. Some of it runs counter to other research. There is a lot to be found that you can dig through. I mean, when I first started my career, I had to go to a big university library or a city library and do my research through what they call the psychological abstracts. Today, it is much easier. You can find them online. But the most important thing is that you have to go through them with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that it is a reputable resource. You have to be careful even of things that are done at universities at studies. This is a group of 18-year-olds who have a certain proclivity to color. How broad is that research base? That's part of my job. But I will tell you that using the color word association studies that we have used over the years has been tremendously helpful, because it also helps us to keep up to date with how general precept of color. Let's take brown, for example. Years ago, if you showed people brown, it was invariably the color of the earth. It was soiled, it was dirty, not a lot of very sophisticated responses to brown. But over the years, as elements like the movie Chocolat, which had a huge influence, by the way, the entertainment field does. Godiva came out with chocolate that you can buy in the drugstore. It became much more of a color that we then could associate with upper level, upper scale. One of our big designers in the U.S., Michael Kors, started to show brown for after 5 wear. That was unheard of. Brown was a country color. It wasn't worn in the city. It wasn't sophisticated. And that started to change, even showing it in sequins and sparkle and paillettes. And brown diamonds became a thing. And the cosmetic companies started to use browner shades of lipstick. And then, of course, from a sociological conception, we started to look at all colors of complexion. And the color nude, for example, isn't nude within every cultural aspect. Nude might be, in as far as Caucasian races are concerned, but let's look at the vast variety of skin tones that are out there, many in the brown family. So you have to take all of this into consideration and not look at information that is perhaps 25 years old, but what is happening in the world today. And in the forecasting that I do, this is a very important element. We do need to bring trends into play. So it's a mixture when we're talking about color of the physiological, the psychological trends, and what influences are out there in the world around us that affect us. And culture, of course, has something to do with it. What culture were you raised in? Are the concepts still the same as they were years ago? That's an interesting question that often comes up. And I do have some answers for that.
Well, we were going to touch on that. So, I mean, to recap, it's basically an ever-moving, transient field. As trends change, then attitudes to certain colours change. That makes perfect sense. I was a child in the 70s. Brown was very popular, but
Yes, absolutely.
There are different associations back in the 70s.
Yes, right. It was an earth color, and that was very big at that time. Avocado was a bad word. You couldn't mention avocado to a client, to anyone in the 80s, because everyone had been so saturated with it as an earth tone in the 70s. So again, we have to look at the time period and how that changes the perception of color. And going back to culture for a moment, what we have found is that with younger generations are not as mired down as older generations, as their fathers and grandfathers were, where a color had a certain concept within a certain culture. Because today, all the kids are looking online, they're checking out what's coming down the runways. Doesn't make any difference whether they live in Taiwan or London or LA. They are all looking at top-level influences and wanting to coordinate that into their wardrobes, into their homes. They're much more open to newer and fresher ideas. So again, you've got to be really cautious, even if you're looking at a specific culture. What demographic are you aiming at? If it's grandpa and he still lives on a farm way outside of the big city, he may still have some of those old precepts. Is that your target audience? That's something you have to consider when you're choosing a color. So there are many ramifications to the choice of a color. I tell my students all the time, you have to research. You must look into the body of evidence that's out there. And I drill them on that particular period of color timing. When did it happen? Who is the demographic?
Fascinating. So, I mean, taking that cultural study a little bit further, we've just opened an office in Singapore, and we've already had a few instances of feedback from various clients on some of our colour selections that here in Europe wouldn't have batted an eyelid, but in Asia there's some cultural perspective or something that we didn't quite understand. I mean, how do you just focus mainly on the States, or do you look at some of these geographical differences in colour as well?
Well, geographical differences, of course, enter into it. I live in an area now, Tucson, Arizona, that's very different from the standpoint of the topography and the light that we see than the Northwest, where I used to live near Seattle. And before that, Los Angeles. And before that, the East Coast. So there are different concepts depending on the area that people are comfortable with. When people move to the Southwest, they want to adapt the look of the Southwest. That's part of the excitement and the romance of being there, and the gorgeous colors in the sky and the sunsets. At the same time, you have to look into where that person came from and how steep they are in those old concepts of color, and if they still want to bring that with them when they're living in a new location. There's no one generality that you can make. You've got to look at every case and look at it from the standpoint of where it's located, and again, the physiological aspect of the color and trends. It could be something that, you look at it and you think, well, they feel a particular way about a color like navy blue, very standard, very classic. But do they have too much navy blue in their wardrobe? Have they overused it? Are they ready for a change? And of course, when you're educating people, and I would think in wayfinding, you are educating people. You are trying to attune their eyes to certain colors. I think if you can give it enough of an explanation as to why that color culturally may not be as acceptable, perhaps in clothing or the interiors, but to use it in signage, in wayfinding, however you're using it, it does have a specific reason for that. So you can educate people at the same time. I think that if you have enough of a knowledge base and you work with experts who give you good, verifiable, credible information, then people will accept it. They might say, okay, it's not a color I would wear, but if it works in signage, it's going to help me see my way, then it's acceptable. But you have to build the story and the reasoning behind it, the rationale.
Are there any particular challenges when you scale colour up? I'm thinking about buildings now and large interiors. We work with a lot of architects, and many of them maybe wouldn't thank me, but I always think architects struggle with colour, and there's probably very good reason for that. Again, it's quite subjective. Often you're applying a colour, and the technology to apply that colour, be it paint or something else, may not last, or there might be all sorts of issues. If you're working with colour at scale, are there any things that we should think about or consider?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've all had this experience. Anyone who works with the CEO of a company and what his wife thinks about the color, what his administrative assistant thinks about the color. Often you get views from people that come from a very personal perspective, and it can be hard to handle. I've had clients who say we can't, let's say we can't use purple. And you might think that some variation of purple is the perfect color for that brand or that product or the packaging or whatever. But the thing that you have to do is then question the reason why. You become the color therapist, so to speak. Can you tell me why you don't like that color? And often you will find that it is something that is rooted in their belief system or happened in their childhood, or someone else has a strong influence on them. And what you have to point out to the client in a very diplomatic way is that happened in your childhood. Today, consumers don't feel this way. You have to, be very elegant about the way that you handle it. But, you find out a great deal about a client when you do start to question them about why they feel so negative about a particular color and they reject it out of hand. For me, it's always a challenge. I love that part of it, I have to tell you. And of course, I have the benefit of having the education, so they're going to respect what I have to say. And you've got to be cautious in the way that you handle it. Again, I tell my students this all the time. I have professionals who take my colors, and I say to them, I know which one of your primary problems is getting this across to the project manager, to someone who is a decision maker. Often the design team is right on target with you. They get it, they understand it. But when you get out of that realm, you often have people who will just go back to their own feelings about color. And of course, the bottom line is, what you're doing is a disservice to your product or to your environment. Because if you automatically negate it, and we feel that it would be a good color to use for these reasons, that's always taken into consideration. Bottom line is a big consideration. Am I going to lose out on my customer, on my client, because I've been so hard-headed about the color to use?
Let's not delve too far into the stories of CEOs' wives. We've all been there, I think.
Right, we've all been there.
It is really interesting. We used to work much more in the sort of branding sphere a few years ago. We still do. And one of the big issues is always colour matching. And, you work at the Pantone Institute. Pantone used to be, I think a lot of people in the branding industry were gravitated from a graphic background, and Pantone, correct me if I'm wrong, it was an ink
Yes.
colour reference chart.
Yes.
So anything that was printed, the Pantone chart was the thing to go to. And it's still, it's still referenced today. But obviously when we're talking about brands, those colours are now digital. They're now they're vinyl film, they're coloured acrylic, they're what I'd call sort of engineering coatings like powder coating and spray coatings. And we always have these issues of trying to convince designers that not every Pantone colour can be matched, and sometimes there's these slight variations because you're using different materials, using different coatings that are using different references, and I guess deep down using different sort of substances to create the colours. Mm-hmm. And then when you add to that, again, in signage, you talk brands, we want a big sign on the wall and it needs to be illuminated. As soon as you put light behind that colour that you've just agreed, it changes the colour completely. So we're all starting again. So it's a big aspect of a brand's asset register is the colour. But actually for us, it's about getting those colour matches across those different materials. I'm sure you've come across similar things. I don't know if you've got any tips or ideas on how you can try and navigate that. We always go outside. Obviously, we'd like to see these things under sunlight conditions. Actually, the ambient light within an office can change things.
Yes.
All over the place. So I don't know if you've got any tips or advice or any anecdotes for us in that area.
Well, differing substrates have always been an issue. I mean, what it looks like in a plastic might be very different than what it looks like in the print. I mean, from the earliest days of doing color and color matching, there are always those challenges. But fortunately, we have people who are so well educated, and at Pantone they do. When we choose the color of the year, for example, when we were choosing the specific shade of red, we needed to make sure that it was the red that was constant in the Pantone system, because everybody that would view that color would then take that as this is a shade of red. But and there's always a disclaimer, even in the Pantone books, it can vary slightly. But again, from an emotional, psychological standpoint, if your eye tells you, and in the end, I truly believe that it is a well-versed, a well-educated eye that can make the difference in a color choice. If you feel that it is, and I hate to use the expression close enough, that sounds very frivolous. Nevertheless, it does get the idea across, because that is what's going to get the messaging out. It's in the red family. It may be a little bluer. It may skew a little bit more to the warm side, but essentially it gets the feeling, the emotional message across of what that color should be. If you strive for perfection in most anything in life, you rarely get there. But I do think that there are very practiced eyes that are constantly working on it, and ultimately, I think it may not be completely overcome, but we get closer and closer all the time.
I'm glad you put that out there. The colour experts say substrates do make a difference. I mean, so often it's that old saying, isn't it? Perfection gets in the way of the good often. We've been in positions where we're trying to do special mixes of different material, special mixes of acrylic, just to try and get that perfect match.
Right.
And I think
another aspect I could tell you is that, for example, anecdotally, I am working with a client right now who makes an amazing resin/acrylic. It's just absolutely gorgeous as a building material. Mm-hmm. And what we are doing is that everything that we suggest to him, we are sending the Pantone chip because we want him to see the actual color as we see it. And of course, it's going to take on a different nuance because of the material that is used. But what he then does is to use the palettes that we have construed for him. He's added new colors, and we've helped him with that. And then ultimately, he sends it to us in a prototype, so that we get to look at it and say, no, it needs to have a little bit more. It has to be a little golder. It needs to be bluer. And we even did that with the Pantone Color of the Year. When the experts at Pantone, the scientists at Pantone, try to get that exact formula, we do the same thing. We speak in very simple language. Let's add a little bit more blue. When people are involved in color, they understand that. That's the language that you speak. They get it. It needs to be grayed down. We need to have a letdown. There are certain expressions that you use that get the idea across till you get it as close as you want it to be.
So is slightly off piece here. So the Pantone reference book, for instance, are you creating new colours every year? I mean, there might be people out there just going, "What are you talking about?" Of course they are. It's not a fixed reference. It's constantly evolving and changing.
Not constantly. We don't do it every year because every year I think is a little bit of overkill. We have to prove to ourselves and to get feedback from the greater design community that there is a need to add a specific color. So we study it, we look at it, we see if there is a bit of space in the fan guide to add a new color. But I would say it's usually a few years before we do that. It's about anywhere between 3 to 5 years before we add a new color. It's got to be proven to us that new color really is needed and there isn't anything that duplicates it in the system.
Fascinating. It's incredible. So, just trying to round up, there's lots I could ask you. I mean, you talked about the colour of the year. I mean, where do you start? What's the process? Is it just a flash of inspiration, or is it just sort of hours?
People get the impression that, we sit around in a room and throw darts and wherever they land on the Pantone chip, that's the color of the year. It's much more involved. There's so much homework that goes into it. Not the least of which is examining the zeitgeist that exists in the world today. What are people looking for emotionally, even from the standpoint of the economics? Is there room for this color? But the psychological aspect of the color is very important in answering that zeitgeist. We think of it on a very international level. It's not just happening here in the US, it's happening all over the world. People are looking for color information. And I can tell you, when I first started to do this in 1999, Pantone started to get calls from people saying, "What is the color of the new millennium?" There was a great concern at that time that the clocks were all going to stop and, there was going to be this huge transition going into the next century. Of course, they didn't stop. And so what I did was to think in terms of what color speaks to the future, what color gives us thoughts of we can be a little bit more serene about the future. We don't have to be as worried. We're entering into a new century. And we came up with a blue that we felt was a particular blue shade that really resonated with people. And it did. It kind of calmed them down as to where we're going in the future. And then we start to look at, are there designers that are using this color? Is it appearing at a certain level at retail, at upper end, where it usually starts? Or we started to look at streetwear too. What's happening on the streets that may change that aspect? We certainly look to the world of entertainment. Really important, because millions of eyes all over the world are trained on the colors they see in films, now in streaming. And it could be films out of Korea, or, not, again, out of the States or out of England, but in other areas as well. We have to be aware of all of this. Is it getting a lot of buzz? Do you feel people are going to talk about this? I'm thinking of the new Pinocchio movie that we had said several years ago. The colors in that film were going to have an effect on colors coming forward, because it was getting so much conversation. The whole story about Pinocchio is very heartrending. And we started to look at the film itself. What are the colors that are used in the film? those darker kind of murky colors? What about some of the other television shows about doom and gloom? That does start to affect the color range that you pull in. But at the same time, we want to uplift people's spirits. We don't want it to be all about doom and gloom. So we have to weigh the color value, how people perceive of it. We look at art. Amazing. It's not just for the elite anymore. Art is out there. People can buy it, posters for very little money. When Steve Wynn in Las Vegas put up the Jackson Pollock exhibit in the 90s, people were lined up around the block. You would think they were waiting to get into the slot machines, but they were waiting to get in to see Jackson Pollock exhibit. It was astounding when I went to Vegas to do a talk. I couldn't believe that all these people who had just been at the slots were now going in to see Jackson Pollock, opening up a whole new world. What colors was Jackson Pollock using? But I have to look at it ahead of time as well. I can't just wait for it to happen. As a forecaster, I need to have my finger on the pulse of what's happening. The movies that are coming out, not what's out there right now. What does the future hold? The automotive industry is a fantastic place to look because they're always experimenting, not only with color, but also with finish. So what are the concept cars? Not the cars that are out there now, but what's on the agenda for the future? This is all of what I have to weigh, not only for color of the year, but as I do forecasting as well.
I mean, that's probably a great place to wind up, thinking about the future and trying to recognise where those future trends come from. I think it's just been fascinating, and I thank you for your time today. Live from Tucson, Arizona. I think that's probably our furthest guest on the show so far. So please tell everybody, if they want to get in touch, what's the best way to find you and get in touch with you?
It would be through leatriceeisman.com. That's where you'd get information about where I might be speaking next, or perhaps a class that I offer both online. And now we're back in person again, which thrills me. I'm a teacher at heart, and to be able to reach out and touch my students is so much better than just simply online. But it certainly filled a purpose during the pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. And we'll put a link in our YouTube video and a podcast, etc. So if people want to get in touch. Leah, thanks so much for your time. Really enjoyed it. I hope people have learned a little bit about your fascinating field. And hopefully we can speak again sometime about this. Excellent.
I would love to. I mean, it's a never-ending subject. It's brilliant.
It's brilliant. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our latest Wayfinding Xchange podcast. Stay tuned for further episodes and feel free to contact us with any questions and suggestions for future episodes.